His mission will be to all. And we have to remember that the message of the good news of Yeshua is for, yes, Jewish people. I find it interesting sometimes that we used to, here at Beth Yeshua, oftentimes the question would first be, well, what's your last name, and are you Jewish? And there was oftentimes a preferential of treatment that was oftentimes given. And part of that's, we have a special calling as a Messianic synagogue, as a Messianic congregation to Jewish people. But we have to recognize that we can never put preferential treatment of one person over and above that of another person, regardless of their ethnic status. The Besorah, the good news of Yeshua, is for all people. To the Jew first, and to the Gentile also. There's a priority, yes, of taking it and restoring it to the Jewish people. In verse 30, Paul remained 2 whole years in his own rented quarters. Paul lived in an apartment. I lived in an apartment for 19 and a half years. In fact, I technically still live in an apartment. It's a condo, but might as well be an apartment, right? It's a living quarters that you pay money for each month. And so, hey, if you live in an apartment, so did Paul. It says Paul remained 2 whole years in his own rented quarters and continued to welcome all who came to him. Again, Paul had the opportunity to be in house imprisonment, and yet people were coming to him to hear the good news of Yeshua. And it says in verse 31, proclaiming or preaching. The Greek says preaching. Again, what does it say? The kingdom of God, and teaching about the Lord Yeshua the Messiah with all boldness and without hindrance. My message today is mission restored. Mission restored. Mission restored. And what is a Messianic Jewish congregation supposed to look like? It's kind of frustrating because when you read through the narratives of the Torah, it's not a lot of specific detail about what you would get that a Messianic synagogue is supposed to. There's only a couple of chapters that actually talk about the biblical festivals, actually. Of course, that's the timeline. There's only a couple of chapters that talk about kashrut, dietary laws. But a part of that, a part of our call is we know, goes back to what we see, obviously, in looking at Acts. And simply is that as Gentiles would come to faith, they said, look, get them past these preliminary basic things, and then let them go. Paul has those, or Moshe has those who preach him in the synagogues on every Shabbat throughout each generation. Let them go and hear him. Now, is that a strong, hardline directive to send all Gentiles into the synagogue? No, it's not. They were starting to meet in house congregations at this time. And at this time, again, the Kahilah, the assembly, is predominantly Jewish. A lot of these things didn't really have to be questioned or discussed. But there is this invitation, there is this encouragement. Hey, look, if they want to grow into some of those higher calling issues, what I call covenant identity markers between God and Israel. And if Gentiles want to go into some of those practices, like, for example, Shabbat, the Moedim, and keeping kosher, wearing tzitzit, things like that, if they want to grow in some of those things, let them go into the synagogue and let them hear Moses. Why? So that they would start practicing some of those things. That right there, to me, gives an indication of a basis for a Messianic synagogue that is Jew and Gentile, one in Messiah, growing to faith. But it was also understood from the apostles that there's some things that they just left open, and they don't necessarily give a clear halakhic, a clear directive on what Gentiles, how much of Torah they should take upon themselves. And so I think that there should be some lenience and some freedom and understanding of how much Gentiles take on upon themselves when it comes to certain things of Torah observance. But in a Messianic synagogue, if a Jewish person does have a strong call to live out the Torah, and that's a part of their calling, not because of they need to do this in order to come to faith in Yeshua, but it's a part of their calling to live out their mission as faithful Jewish people, it makes sense then that in a Messianic synagogue you're going to be celebrating Shabbat, and you're going to be celebrating the Moedim, the biblical festivals, and that yes, you're going to be eating to a level of kashrut, kosher in that environment. Now again, what Gentiles do on their own, that's between you and the Lord. Now some people might think that I'm wrong to say that. But again, what do we see in the apostolic writings, and what is their application of the Torah? I think that the Messianic synagogue needs to be one that is deeply connected to the church, yet has a heart for the synagogue as well.